Okay. So you know what we got to do. It's the beginning of class. I hope you all have been conditioned for this already. Warm up your hands. Get ready. First period, before the flood. And everybody loud and clear with me. And then we have the flood. And then we have the scattering of the people. The patriarchs. Exodus from Egypt. Wandering in the wilderness. Invasion and conquest of Canaan. Judges. United kingdom. Divided kingdom. Judah alone. Judah goes into captivity. A remnant returns from captivity. Period of silence for 400 years. The life of Christ, the early church, and letters to the Christians. All right. Thanks, guys, for going along with that and be loud. So, we're not going to start from the beginning like we've been doing. That's just like it's starting to eat up way too much class time, and we got a lot to cover in this class anyway. We can start from the United Kingdom, though, since it's kind of important for understanding the condition of Judah during the periods that we're covering in this class. But under the United Kingdom, after the judges, the Judah and all of Israel is united underneath three kings during this time period: Saul, David, and Solomon. But because of Solomon's immorality, him listening to the voices of his wives and setting up high places and the idolatry of the people during this time period, basically the kingdom was split into two pieces under the reign of his son, Rehoboam. And so you had Jeroboam, and it's fun how those names are so similar, huh? Jeroboam becomes the king of Israel in the north, right? And then Judah in the south has Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, as the king. And then we have the rest of that time period. It does last about 200 years until Israel is taken away into captivity. And why were they taken away? The Bible doesn't leave us guessing, does it? What's the reason for them being taken away?
Unfaithful to God.
Yeah, they were unfaithful to God. All of the kings in Israel never did what was right in the sight of the Lord. In fact, it was kind of like a competition. Who can outdo who? You have King Ahab, who's kind of like the benchmark for evil, right? You want to talk about an evil king, that's Ahab, And if there's a guy who's even worse than Ahab, then you're talking about somebody that was like really bad. Getting near Hitler level kind of bad, right? And then you have Judah, that is not very far. Oh, I should have taken that slide out. Too much information. Then you have Judah for a while in this period of Judah alone after Israel gets taken away or really destroyed. And you have certain kings like Hezekiah and Manasseh and Josiah and also several prophets there, minor prophets that you can read, except for Jeremiah. He's a major prophet. And this time period is kind of Judah kind of struggling along. There's some, glimmer of light with Josiah's reign, but then kind of after Josiah, Egypt comes in and replaces the king, and kind of gets to say who gets to be king. And then after that, Babylon comes in and kind of reigns and sets up a king in Israel who's really more of a puppet king for Babylon, until eventually Babylon just comes in and burns Jerusalem down to the ground. So then we talked about last time Judah going into captivity. And there are those Bible passages that we read a while ago about why Israel went into captivity. And the Bible passages about Judah going into captivity are pretty much the same. They followed after the iniquity of Israel. They set up idols for themselves. They rebelled against God. That's what caused them to be carried away into captivity. However, God didn't destroy them completely, right? God promised that there would be a remnant of people who, after a period of about 70 years, would come back from that Babylonian exile to rebuild Jerusalem. That was the promise that they had to look forward to. It was a faithful remnant would return. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Is that clear? Is that kind of cohesive? All right. One other thing that we didn't really talk about last time is that you have the stories of Daniel and Ezekiel during the time of this captivity. Has it ever struck you how different those two prophets are? They have very, very different experiences in captivity, don't they? Where does Daniel spend most of his time?
It's like a capital city as an official.
Yeah. So, King Nebuchadnezzar sees Daniel. He's an intelligent, bright young man. And so Nebuchadnezzar takes Daniel and he brings him to the palace. And Daniel is kind of serving as this wise man to the king. A retainer, kind of. And the prophecies that Daniel has, the visions that he has, is like, you can hardly tell what's going on at times. It's a worthy study. There are very specific prophecies about what's going to happen in the world and specific prophecies about the Messiah. But Daniel is very different. He's living in this palace. And then comes along Ezekiel. And where does Ezekiel live? Yeah. On the banks of the river Chebar, or Chebar, or however you say that. And he's just kind of surviving along with the common people that got swept away into Babylon. And it's depressing. I mean, everybody on this river is mourning the destruction of Zion, their holy city. And they're just remembering it. And a big portion of Ezekiel is devoted to this kind of like this vision about the temple and about Jerusalem. And just think about that, the way that speaks to a people who are just living in shacks by a river in Babylon, remembering and longing for the temple that they lost because of their sins. And so it's really, really impactful. Now, after this 70 years, Persia ends up coming in and doing away with Babylon. And King Cyrus issues the decree that the Jews are now allowed to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild. We find this in Ezra chapter 1. Can someone read verses 1 through 4 of Ezra chapter 1?
Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord sent the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you and all of his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judea, and rebuild the house of the Lord. Now there were those who came from Telmithia, Telmashah.
Are you in chapter 3? Oh, you're good.
The God of Israel, he is the God who is in Jerusalem. And every survivor, at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a free will offering from the house of God which is in Jerusalem.
Oh, thank you. So, what strikes you about this edict from Cyrus?
Well, he's not a Jew, and yet God is using him for his eternal purpose.
Yeah. Isn't it like kind of amazing? like here's this random Persian king who comes in and overthrows this world power, right? That took the Jews into captivity. He overthrows this world power, and then, kind of as like the first thing he does, says, all right, Jews get to go home now. Not only that, but how supportive is he of the idea that they're going to go and rebuild the temple to Yahweh? He's like incredibly supportive. And you have to wonder, well, is that a coincidence? No, not at all. And so a lot of Ezra is dedicated to this work of rebuilding the temple. Janice.
But Isaiah prophesied by name. So he was an implement of God.
Yeah. This even in the prophets are talking about this time of the return and the king that would allow them to go back. And so it's just one of those moments in the Bible where you see God shifting the pieces around in order to accomplish His will. It's really, really cool. One cool thing about this, what does Cyrus give to the Jews as they return? Mike, did you have your hand? Oh, okay. I'll come back to you then after this. What does he give to them? Yeah. He gives them back the things that were taken from the temple, along with gold, silver, precious things. Do you guys remember something in the Bible about Israelites leaving some kind of captivity and taking with them articles of gold and silver?
Well, the Egyptians borrowed things from them, and they were actually given them.
Sure. Yeah. So it's interesting how this is mirroring the Exodus from Egypt, right? And in fact, in Jeremiah, that's exactly what God says. In Jeremiah 16 and in Jeremiah 26, there's this idea that God is going to save them from a captivity, and they're not even going to talk about the captivity that they were saved from back in Exodus, from Egypt. This is going to be a great salvation. And it's going to be so much better than the salvation they saw before. However, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different. Back in Egypt, they were saved through the parting of the Red Sea. God literally divided an entire sea, led His people through on dry land, and then the armies rushed in and the waters collapsed over them and they perished in the water. And then the people afterward, they sang this great song. And you remember the number of fighting men that left Egypt? It was like 500,000, And that's beside what you would imagine with the women and the children. The people that left the Babylonian captivity was about 50,000. Not very many compared to the first salvation. And what miracle occurred to allow the Israelites to return? Not much. Cyrus signed a decree. And it wasn't some kind of awesome parting of waters and the destruction of enemies. Cyrus signed a decree. I think the conclusion that we look at, when we talk about these prophecies from Jeremiah about how great the salvation is going to be, God isn't looking necessarily at physically how great it is. But the people who are returning to Jerusalem in this time period are going to be much more faithful and have a deeper relationship to God than the Israelites who returned out of Egypt. And I think that's kind of the way that God is looking at it. But I'm open to suggestions there too.
What would be interesting is that when they fled Egypt, everyone wanted to leave. When it came time, 70 years after captivity, to go back to the land, a lot of people had assimilated in the land and were not really anxious to leave. They were satisfied with where status quo was. So those who did leave, you found out how better they were. This would have been the devoted that he talked about.
Sure. Yeah, Mike's bringing up the point that all of the Israelites left Egypt, right? And yet in this return from Babylon, or from exile, that not all of them are going to leave. We're going to read, well, you can read the story of Esther, where there's a lot of Jews still living in Persia. And that's a while after this decree is made by Cyrus to go back to Jerusalem. So what do you make of that, It's one of the questions you guys struggle with. What other comment did you have before I got carried away?
Asking what was motivating King Persia to let people know it. I think it's important to understand that it was the Lord who stirred his mind up. So the Lord's hand was in this. The Lord was in the hand of going into captivity. His hand was in the return that he had promised them would occur at the same time.
Yeah. The Lord was at the center of all of this. Yeah.
Jewish influence in all those places was going to be part of what spread the gospel at the beginning of that era. That there were synagogues all through the Gentile lands. Strong presence in places like Egypt by that time, like Alexandria. So when the treasurer goes back to Ethiopia, he's had these Jewish influences, and that's really what got it going before the Gentiles were brought in also.
Yeah. That's a cool side note to make there. That the synagogues and the scriptures are being proliferated in the area of their exile during this time period, and laying the foundation for Christians later on down the road. Yeah, good point. So there's three waves of returnees from exile. The first one is under Zerubbabel, and you have Zerubbabel and Jeshua who comes with him. Zerubbabel is functioning kind of as the governor or the king. He's from the line of David. And then Jeshua he's the high priest. And so they're able to trace his lineage back and establish him as a high priest. And the big thing with the book of Ezra is, of course, yes, rebuilding the temple, but that also means rededicating themselves to worship and relearning the law of the Lord and really purifying worship before God. Because they've been away for a long time. They've forgotten a lot of things. And it's been like 70 years before they could actually engage in temple worship the way that it's supposed to be. However, the Jews started rebuilding the temple, but they, after 1 year, after they lay the foundation of the temple, they stop. And that's in a large part due to the opposition from their enemies. A lot of them are people from Samaria or from across the Jordan who end up writing or trying to confuse the Israelites into not building the temple anymore. However, we have prophets Haggai and Zechariah who stand up, and their mission is to stir the people up to rebuild the temple, right? And Haggai's message is so straightforward, as it's only 2 chapters, very, very small prophet. But his message is, why are you living in paneled houses while the house of the Lord remains in shambles, in rubble. You know, what's going on here? Cyrus told you, build the temple. God wants you to build the temple. Restore your relationship with him, and yet it's not really a priority for them. And so he stirs them up. And then you have the prophecies of Zechariah, which are a bit different from Haggai's. Haggai's got this, this direct approach. What are you guys doing? Build a temple. Come on. And then Zechariah is like, hey guys, I had like 8 dreams last night. You're not going to believe what I just saw. There was like this lady and she got thrown in a pot, and then there were these like stork ladies that carried it away. And it's like, very different prophets. And very different ways of communicating, but pretty much the same thing, right? Both of them communicated their words from the Lord to the people of Israel to stir them up to rebuild the temple. And yet, they're very different. Haggai's direct. He says, build the temple. No allegory, no nothing. All right? And Zechariah says, here's a vision that I got. And he goes into great detail, great depth about things that we struggle to understand. But I think it's interesting to understand the importance of the two different approaches. Sometimes you need a direct approach to something. But there's also the importance of a vision. Something portrayed as idyllic as possible. Something that is deep and something that you need to think about in order to understand. I think those are both very important. And we maybe side toward one or the other as far as our personal preferences. But God sends both. And we need to appreciate both. And also be well-rounded in what we learn about and what we teach. So the people are stirred up to rebuild the temple. There's some question about chronology in Ezra. I don't even know whether to get into this. But basically you have Cyrus, who ends up being the one that signs the decree. After him is Cambyses, who reigns for like 8 years or so. And then you have this one other guy, I'm not going to even mention his name, it's not important. And then you have Darius. And in the days of Darius, they start rebuilding the temple. And there's a question about, in chapter 4, verses 6 through 23, records like this occasion where the enemies of Israel try to stop them from working. And so they write a letter to, it says, Ahasuerus, and then they write a letter to Artaxerxes. And basically, you have to wonder who's Ahasuerus and who's Artaxerxes. I believe it makes the most sense that verses 6 through 23 is like an out-of-sequence, parenthetical story to kind of get the story across that enemies have always been trying to thwart Israel's attempt at restoring the temple. Artaxerxes and Ahasuerus, I believe, are kings that only come along after King Darius. And so that's kind of where I'm thinking with that. That might be information overload and outside of what we're trying to do, but it confused me while I was trying to read through it, so maybe it helps you guys. The story of Esther might be best seen as occurring sometime after Ezra 6 and before Ezra 7, just kind of in that time period, about, what did I put up there? Yeah, 485 BC. And then at the beginning of Ezra 7, we see Ezra leads a return, the second wave of exiles returning to Judea. And then Nehemiah, of course, recorded in the book Nehemiah. Interesting thing about that, Ezra and Nehemiah originally were kind of contained in the same scroll. They were seen as one book. You had Ezra 1 and then Ezra 2 maybe is the way you would divide it up. But it's telling the same story, really. It's a story of people returning from captivity and picking up the pieces. And so Nehemiah rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem, and then there's the purification and the rededication of the Lord's people as they're further established. And also Malachi is thought to have come with Nehemiah in that last return. And Malachi is the last Old Testament prophet. Let me check my notes to see I haven't missed anything. Okay. Questions or comments about all of that? Does that make sense? Basically, if you just want to generalize, the return from captivity, it starts with Ezra, and it's the return of God's people after 70 years to pick up the pieces, rededicate themselves to God, and learn how to be His. And they do much better at it than the Israelites did when they left Egypt. Paul?
One of the prophecies would tell them you're going to be punished. And then end with a ray of hope.
Yeah.
Ultimately, things are going to get better. So they had something to look forward to overall.
Yeah.
It wasn't fully fulfilled until the Son came.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is that I think it's in Zechariah that God promises that Jerusalem would be inhabited, a city that would not have walls, because Jerusalem would be ever expanding. It would have so many people in it that they would always be building outward, and they would never make a wall because they just can't contain the amount of people. And instead, God would be a wall of fire protecting His people. That's a prophecy Zechariah made, and I believe it was before the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. But then Nehemiah does come. Nehemiah does build a wall, right? And Jerusalem doesn't expand beyond the walls. So what's the fulfillment of that prophecy?
We're saying the same thing. Spiritual Jerusalem, like we talked about.
Sure. To the people in Zechariah's time, it would have been encouraging, right? And it, not taking it super literally, you can see that God's going to protect His people, right? But ultimately, that spiritual Jerusalem is what we're looking for, right? People that are always growing, that are always adding on house after house, person after person, and God protects His people. That's what we're supposed to see in that. So this return kind of is, in a lot of prophecies, glorified. And a lot of people were looking forward to it, but it falls short of what God ultimately has planned in the spiritual Jerusalem.
With the Exodus from Egypt, they brought the idolatry and the idolatrous worship and mindset with them. That doesn't happen this time. Even though they were in a land of worshiping people, they didn't bring it with them.
Yeah. Yeah, idolatry doesn't seem to have the same draw on these people as it did for those who left Egypt. And we're going to see that they maybe went off the rails with the conservatism later on as we go into the period of silence, where they maybe started drawing lines where God didn't necessarily tell them to. But yeah. So as we move on to the 400 years of silence, of course, there's no Bible passages that I can tell you to open up to. Unless maybe just for fun, you want to open up your Bible to the page after Malachi and look at the blank page. You can do that if you want. Maybe you could even scribble these things down on that blank page. I wouldn't necessarily argue with that. around 330 BC, there's the fall of the Persian Empire that happens. And in their place, there's this Grecian Empire that rises up under Alexander the Great. And he goes and his dad had made an army that was like a, like a modern day equivalent would be like some rich guy having a son, and the rich guy just hands his son the cars to a Bugatti, and he says, go. That's what happened with Alexander the Great. I mean, he had an army that was like nothing the world had ever seen up until this point. And he goes out and he completely dominates the ancient world. What's interesting about this, he was pretty easy on Jerusalem, though. And I can't help but kind of see God working through this. Josephus, in the Antiquities of the Jews, records Alexander as coming to Jerusalem and bowing and paying homage to the Lord God Yahweh, because Alexander had a dream that God visited him in the night or something like that. Interesting to think about. But the Jews were allowed to keep their identity, to keep their city, and to keep their religious practices until you have the splintering of the Grecian Empire. But on the note of Alexander the Great, a word about Bucephalus. It's his horse that he rode, and Bucephalus... I'm just kidding. I'm not going to... I'm not actually going to talk about Bucephalus. I just thought it would be funny because the book told me not to. So the Grecian Empire, after Alexander's death, split up into like three major parts. And so those parts basically were fighting each other for a long time after Alexander's death. And that's where you get the Seleucid Empire, Syria and Mesopotamia, and they are at war with the Ptolemaic kingdom, which was down where Egypt was. And so those were both areas that Alexander had conquered, and then now that he's dead, they have their own kind of kingdoms set up, and they're fighting with each other. And, funny thing, who happens to be right between Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt? Yeah. And in fact, I have a map. So basically, this is the kingdom of Alexander the Great at his height, and so you have Syria and Mesopotamia here, the Seleucid Empire later on. That's right. I should have Siri preach this for me. I was kind of curious what it would say. So we have Mesopotamia and Syria. The Seleucid Empire is what this would later be known as. And they are fighting with the Ptolemaic side of the empire here. And of course, Judah, Jerusalem, just kind of caught in the crossfire. Eventually, Seleucid Empire ends up winning this scuffle. And the Seleucid Empire... Antiochus Epiphanes the Fourth, all right? He ends up coming in, and he tries to completely destroy Jerusalem's religious identity. And so he pressures and he forces the Jews to conform to the Greek gods, Zeus and Hermes, Poseidon, and all that. He tries to force them to conform to that, and that inspires what is known as the Maccabean Revolt. And so Israel fights back, and they end up engaging in pretty much guerrilla warfare against the Seleucid Empire, and winning some battles, and eventually they're granted their religious freedom. However, something that they observed, let's see. There you go. The difficulty here is that, think about it, as a nation, the Jews are under kind of a religious threat. And nothing has made it clearer than Antiochus Epiphanes and his attack on their faith. And so in order to help preserve their faith and to protect it, they establish parties, or parties develop, known as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and later on the Essenes. And their role is to protect the faith. Keep to the traditions. Don't let anything come in and destroy the faith of the Jews. And so that's the reason for them coming onto the stage, and later on we see the conflict between them and Jesus.
And all those kingdoms were the prophecy or the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had.
So Janice is pointing out that as we see the turning of the world nations and the leaders, it references back to the vision that Daniel had about all of the kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar? Oh yeah, Nebuchadnezzar had the vision. Sorry. No, you're good. I'll let it slide this one time. Paul.
We still need to see the hand of God in setting the stage for the coming of the Son.
Yep.
And that was establishing the language and the thought processes in that part of the world that made it the right time.
Yeah.
It's also pretty much believed that some of the things in Hebrews 11 of the people of faith, when it talks about those that were killed horribly, probably happened during this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, this is not a peaceful time period. A whole lot of things are moving around and changing. A lot of people dying, and at the same time, during the end of the Seleucid Empire, around 140, 143, somewhere around there, Rome comes into the eastern Mediterranean area, and they begin to kind of establish their power in that region, and just the power as a nation. And they continue growing until BC 60 or something like that. They're well established as the world power that we see them be in the New Testament. And through that comes a lot of things. God waited for the opportune time, right? God waited for the right time to send forth Jesus. And there's a lot that goes into that. Before Rome developed and had control over Palestine, you didn't have really, great roads. You didn't have the great writing and reading system of Greek. But all those things came to fruition as the Roman Empire took control of this area. And those things were used for the furthering of the gospel, as Paul used those roads, as many of the disciples used those roads. And many of the disciples, I got it, Paul. Many of the disciples wrote letters in great detail about who Jesus was and what he did, what he said, and about the doctrine of Christ. So everything is kind of lining up, right? Herod the Great is eventually given the kingdom of Judea, or given authority over Judea, and that's basically all of Palestine. And his contribution is that he gives basically a renovated temple over to the Jews as a gift, a peace gift. And you remember the disciples saying to Jesus, "Look at this temple. Look at these great stones." The time back there in the first century, they were still enjoying, they had their honeymoon phase of a renovated temple. And that was a part of this gift to the Jews from Herod. So, I hope that kind of, I don't know, you maybe learned something if you didn't know much about this period in between Malachi and Matthew. I sure learned a lot. Any other comments or questions before we end up wrapping up class? Rhonda?
I always was thinking about the 400 years of silence. I always said, why did God have 400 years of silence? To me, it was the proving of that his remnant would remain. Because you go into the New Testament and the Word talks about Simeon, that he was a devout man waiting for the promise of the consolation of Israel. So, in the beginning part, third generation, they forgot God. They started doing idols. But this proved that God kept a remnant from the 400 years until the Christ came, and his promise that he would never leave his people. And it's the same thing when the church began. People want to say the Reformation. The church never went out of existence. That is still there. There is a remnant that still remains that stays faithful to him from. And that, the 400 years to me is more proof of God's promise that his remnant will remain.
Yeah.
As I was young, I was like, why in the world did he say silent?
God's control over the shifting of empires and world powers didn't end at the cross of Jesus. And a lot of times maybe we think that way, that now people just do whatever, But God still has full control over the things that happen. And he causes things to work out for good for those who believe. And so we need to remember that. And this is proof of it. Yeah, good point. Anything else? We got time for somebody to make a 2-minute long comment. Just kidding. We have extra time, so you know what we're going to do? What's the first one? Before the flood. The flood. The scattering of the people. The patriarchs. Exodus from Egypt. Wandering in the wilderness. Invasion and conquest of Canaan. Judges. United kingdom. Abby, your hands aren't moving. Divided kingdom. Judah alone. Judah goes into captivity. A remnant returns from captivity. Janice. Period of silence for 400 years. Life of Christ. Early church. And letters to the Christians. All right. Thank you, everybody.